Council members, please come to order. So, over the last numerous days, we've completed our staff presentations, excellent staff presentations on C2, and received extensive public testimony. Completed that last night, and we are at the point of taking action. So I'll see what the wishes of the council are on C2. Yes, Ms. Baker.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I do have a motion that's been sent to staff, and while that's getting posted, I just wanted to, for members of the public who maybe aren't that familiar with our process, typically what I'm planning to do is read the motion into the record and walk through the details of the motion to try to get through some of those complex details first, and then kind of speak more generally later, just to give you an idea of how that might go.
Okay, we'll give a moment for the motion to be presented on the screen. Yeah. Okay, we're waiting for the motion to get posted online, so we'll let you know when that happens. Yes, please, Ms. Baker.
Thank you, Madam Chair. The motion reads, the council revises the alternatives as follows and recommends publication of the revised DEIS with the addition of analysis of the revised options. Additions are in bold and underline, and deletions are in strikeout. Alternative 2 and 3 are mutually exclusive. All other alternatives and options are not mutually exclusive unless otherwise indicated below. Staff should include SSC recommendations in the next draft as practicable. Alternative 1 is the status quo. Alternatives 2 through 4 apply to the entire Bering Sea pollock bee season, the season in which chum salmon are taken as bycatch, also called prohibited species catch or PSC. Alternative 2, the overall bycatch PSC limit for chum salmon. Chum salmon PSC limit based on historical total bycatch numbers, a range of 100,000 or approximately 17,100 Western Alaska chum salmon to 550,000 or approximately 94,050 Western Alaska chum salmon. All non-Chinook salmon taken as bycatch during the bee season would accrue to the limit, regardless of origin. PSC limits are apportioned among CDQ, catcher processor, mothership, and inshore sectors using a blended adjusted CDQ bycatch rate, as with Amendment 91, with the exception of option 4, based on the following options. The sub-option must be selected in combination with another option. Option 1, historical total bycatch by sector using the 3-year average from 2020 to 2022. Option 2, historical total bycatch by sector using the 5-year average from 2018 to 2022. Option 3, pro rata 25% AFA allocation and 75% historical total bycatch from 2020 to 2022. And option 4, a pro rata based on AFA pollock allocation. Suboption, for any of the four options above, also establish a CDQ chum salmon PSC reserve pool. The CDQ chum salmon reserve pool exists outside of the overall chum salmon PSC limit/corridor cap and may only be accessed by a CDQ group if a CDQ group informs NIMS in writing by November 15th of any year, that is prior to the annual groundfish harvest specifications process, of a plan to associate their pollock CDQ with the inshore or mothership sector. Upon such notification, NIMS will apportion an amount of chum salmon PSC to the group or groups from the CDQ chum salmon PSC reserve pool that matches the chum to pollock proportion ratio apportioned to the sector with which it is associating, either the mothership or inshore. All CDQ pollock from a group must be associated with the same sector, and sector associations cannot be changed mid-season. The sector limits are further apportioned at the CDQ group and inshore cooperative level in proportion to each CDQ group and inshore cooperative's pollock allocation. Chum salmon PSC can be transferred among sectors, CDQ groups, and inshore cooperatives. Reaching a limit closes the pollock fishery sector to which the limit applies. Alternative 3, overall bycatch or PSC limit for chum salmon triggered by a Western Alaska Chum Salmon Abundance Index. Indices based on prior year's chum salmon abundance. Options below are mutually exclusive. All non-Chinook salmon taken as bycatch during the B season would accrue to the limit based on the range specified in Alternative 2, regardless of origin. Option 1, 3 area chum salmon index based on Yukon River summer plus Yukon River fall run abundance. Suboptions, 1,713,300 or 2,781,400. Kuskokwim River, composed of the Kuskokwim sonar. Suboptions, 151,636 or 306,017. Norton Sound, composed of summed escapement for the Snake, Nome, El Dorado, Quinnipiac, and North Rivers, and total Norton Sound harvest. Suboptions, 57,300 or 91,500. If 3 of 3 areas are above the index threshold, no chum salmon PSC limit the following year. If 2 of 3 areas are above the index threshold, chum salmon PSC limit the following year is suboptions 100,000 to 550,000. If 1 or no areas are above the index threshold, chum salmon PSC limit the following year is 75% of the above limit. Option 2, chum salmon index based on Yukon River summer. Suboptions 1,268,700 or 1,978,400 plus Yukon River fall run abundance. Suboptions 444,600 or 803,000. If 2 of 2 areas are above the index threshold, no chum salmon PSC limit the following year. If 1 or no areas are above index threshold, chum salmon PSC limit the following year is suboptions 100,000 or 550,000. Apportionments and transfer provisions are the same as Alternative 2. Alternative 4, additional regulatory requirements for incentive plan agreements. Include in the IPA regulations at 50 CFR 679.21 the following additive changes to further prioritize avoidance of areas and times of highest proportion of coastal Western Alaska and upper middle Yukon chum salmon stocks. The requirements would be added to the existing federal regulations for IPAs at 50 CFR 679.21, paragraph F12. And the annual reporting requirements at section 679.21, paragraph F13 would still apply. 1, require the pollock sectors to describe in their IPA how genetic stock composition data are included in chum salmon avoidance measures. 2, Require the pollock sectors to describe in their IPAs how they monitor for potential chum salmon avoidance closures more than once per week. 3, require the use of salmon excluders for the duration of A and B season. 4, require the pollock sectors to develop chum salmon vessel outlier provisions and implement within their IPA. 5, require IPAs to provide weekly salmon bycatch reports to Western and Interior Alaska salmon users to allow for more transparency in reporting. 6, require the pollock sector IPAs to prohibit fishing in bycatch avoidance areas for all vessels regardless of performance when ADFG weekly stat area bycatch rates exceed 5 chum per ton of pollock in the catcher processor sector and 3 times the base rate in the catcher vessel and mothership sector. Alternative 5, in-season corridor cap. PSC cap on total chum salmon in combined areas 1 and 2 during June 10th to August 31st. Cap range of 50,000 total chum salmon, or approximately 8,550 Western Alaska chum salmon, to 350,000 total chum salmon, or approximately 59,850 Western Alaska chum salmon. All non-Chinook salmon bycatch in clusters 1 and 2 accrues to the caps regardless of origin. The cap for combined clusters 1 and 2 and closure time period are set in federal regulations. Additional windows for salmon passage and other avoidance measures should be implemented in season through the contractual incentive plan agreements using in-season fishery data and best available genetic data. Apportionments and transfer provisions are the same as Alternative 2 and based on historical bycatch within each cluster individually and then combined. Option 1, if the cap is met during the time period, NMFS closes all ADF&G stat areas inside cluster 1 and 2 to that sector or sectors for the rest of the time period. The corridor area closure is set in federal regulations. Suboption 1, reaching the cap triggers a corridor closure comprised of 29 ADF&G stat areas, or approximately 75% of the clusters of 75% in cluster 1 and 2. Option 2, if the cap is met during the time period, the IPA's pre-approved corridor area closes to that sector or sectors for the rest of the time period. The corridor closure must be described in the IPA and pre-approved by NMFS before B season. The criteria for a corridor closure area are set in federal regulation. The corridor closure must 1, be within combined clusters 1 and 2, 2, comprised of a range of 19 to 29 ADF&G stat areas, or approximately 50 to 75%, and 3, be selected based on chum catch, pollock CPUE, and relevant genetic data. Option 3, abundance-based threshold, mutually exclusive to Alternative 3. Chum salmon index based on Yukon River summer and Yukon River fall run reconstructions. If the prior year's chum salmon abundance for both Yukon River summer and Yukon River fall reconstruction are at or above the index values, the corridor cap and closure provisions would not apply. Suboption 1, 75th percentile, Yukon River summer, 2,671,450, and Yukon River fall, 1,150,758. Suboption 2, 90th percentile, Yukon River summer, 3,871,700, and Yukon River fall, 1,390,329. Option 4, adjust the winter herring savings area start date for the pollock fishery from September 1st to September 30th. Option 3 and 4 are not mutually exclusive and can be selected in combination with option 1 or 2. Oh, the second, Madam Chair. I can speak to the option, or excuse me, the motion.
Thank you for the second, Mr. Twite. Ms. Baker. Yep. Whenever you're ready.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I apologize. I'll first start. I just would like to walk through the changes that I'm proposing. Overall, I'd like to say that the overall intent of this motion is to generally be quite consistent with what the AP put forward. I just really appreciated the work that the advisory panel did on that. And so I've picked up a lot of that, and I'll just describe where I'm suggesting some differences. So first, moving to alternative 2. What I am suggesting here is that we add a sub-option to be responsive to the public testimony that we heard and the concept that the AP included in its motion to address the, that we heard about addressing some of the unique leasing dynamics within the CDQ sector that is likely to be influenced by the apportionment options in this action. Just as a reminder, with very few exceptions, CDQ has been historically fished entirely on catcher processors in the pollock fishery, and the concerns that we heard in public testimony related to the potential for future capacity issues or operational decisions in the catcher processor fleet that could potentially result in catcher processor platforms being unavailable for a variety of reasons and necessitating CDQ groups to find alternate harvesting arrangements on catcher vessels or motherships. The intent of the CDQ buffer, PSC buffer pool that is proposed in the sub-option would be to maintain the existing allowable transferability of CDQ across sectors under a new potential chum salmon bycatch program in the pollock fishery. I just want to reiterate the buffer pool as intended would only be accessible if a CDQ group needed to harvest its quota in the catcher vessel or mothership sector. And based on the testimony we heard, I would anticipate that in most years, only a portion of the pool would be accessed and potentially none at all. Moving on, moving on to alternative 3, I have picked up the advisory panel modification to this alternative in terms of replacing the index for the Kuskokwim area. The council had originally identified the Bethel test fishery CPUE as the data source for the index here. I'm recommending, as the AP did, that we replace that with the Kuskokwim sonar. Given that funding for the Bethel test fishery is uncertain, I think it makes a lot of sense and appreciate the AP recommending that we replace that with the Kuskokwim sonar. And there's a strong positive relationship between chum salmon sonar passage and the Bethel test fishery chum salmon CPUE. And based on the strong positive relationship between these two indices, our staff actually worked with staff from the Kuskokwim River Intertribal Fish Commission to hindcast values for the Kuskokwim sonar that are comparable to the longer time series that exists for the test fishery. And so I have included the values in the motion for the 25th and 50th percentile based on that hindcasted 1992 through 2022 time series, which is consistent with the values for the other indices included in the alternative 3 options. Moving on to alternative 4. Oh, I guess I'm sorry, Madam Chair. I should also mention in alternative 3, you'll notice that I'm suggesting striking the apportionment language that's in alternative 3 and referencing that we use the same apportionments in alternative 2. There is no change substantively to that. I was simply trying to streamline the motion and avoid repetition. So just pointing that out. Alternative 4, again, the changes that I'm suggesting to the language here, I think as I was reading through the motion, I think the first few paragraphs there in alternative 4 were maybe holdover from previous motions. And just to streamline, I'm suggesting combining a little bit of those and keeping the same intent in terms of additional regulatory requirements for incentive plan agreements. And then really just proposing one minor change in the first suggested change to IPA provisions to really reflect the conversation I think we've had throughout the meeting here in terms of given that we're getting closer and closer to more real-time genetic stock composition data, I think it would just be wise to prepare for that and perhaps remove the word historical before genetic stock composition data in that component of the IPAs to allow them to be a little more flexible for further improvements in our ability to more timely receive genetic stock composition data. Alternative 5, the intent again of my motion is to be consistent with what the advisory panel recommended, with a few clarifications. And one modification that I will describe first off the bat is that I am proposing that for the in-season corridor cap, although I am moving forward with the AP's recommendation to establish an in-season corridor cap for combined clusters 1 and 2, I am recommending that the lower end of the range for the cap that we would be evaluating is 50,000 total chum salmon, as opposed to the AP recommendation for 100,000. And also picking up the AP modification to increase the range for analysis to 350,000 total chum salmon to accommodate the fact that we're combining 2 areas together in this particular option if this motion passes. The other thing that I wanted to point out that is an addition to the advisory panel motion is at the end of this first paragraph, just clarifying again with apportionments that the apportionment and transfer provisions for this alternative 5 in-season corridor cap are the same as alternative 2 and based on historical chum salmon bycatch within each cluster individually and then combined. Moving down to the options, should look familiar from the advisory panel motion. Just some clarification suggestions here in terms of making really clear that, excuse me, during option 1, if the cap is met during the time period, NIMS will close all ADF and GSTAT areas inside cluster 1 and 2. No modifications to the advisory panel recommendations for suboption 1. Thank you. And some slight suggestions for wording modifications, I think, to option 2, but nothing intended to change substantively, just for clarification. Option 3, I have picked up the AP recommendation to include an abundance-based threshold. And the details of this option are different than what the AP included. First off, I am recommending that we specify that alternative 5, option 3, as proposed here, is mutually exclusive to alternative 3. And I did that for a couple of different reasons. I was thinking about the potential, really the analysis going forward if this motion should pass. And conceptually, the council could select alternative 3, which is an overall PSC limit with a low abundance threshold that would change the overall limit And under alternative 5, option 3, we are contemplating a high abundance threshold, if you will, for the corridor cap, at which the corridor cap may be relieved at high levels of abundance for the index we specify. Just thinking through the interaction of those two potential, the alternative 3 and alternative 5, option 3 working together, it seemed like there might be some potential conflicting interactions between when caps did and did not apply. And quite frankly, the complexity I just felt was a little overwhelming that I couldn't really think through. And I'd rather not have that sort of complex interaction. I just think that would be difficult to implement, difficult to operate under. And so I am suggesting that we make alternative 3 and alternative 5, option 3, if this moves forward, mutually exclusive, to keep it a little bit simpler. So the change I'm suggesting to the AP's motion is to really provide staff with a little bit more specificity in terms of what the council would like to see for a high abundance index threshold. And so essentially what I've taken is alternative 3, option 2, which is using the Yukon River Summer and Yukon River Fall Run reconstructions to establish the threshold, except for because we are considering a high abundance threshold here, I've included the sub-options for 75th percentile of those index values and 90th percentile to evaluate the potential impacts of alternative 5 and relieving the corridor cap under those abundance levels. Option 4 would be to adjust the winter herring savings area start date, as the AP recommended, simply clarifying that the intention would be to adjust that start date for the pollock fishery only. And I believe, Madam Chair, that's a high-level explanation of the changes I'm suggesting. I've already spoken to this a little bit, but to maybe provide a little bit more insight into the overall motion. I first wanted to take a moment to thank the council staff, NIM staff, our SSC advisory panel, and all of the members of the public who came to this meeting and previous meetings to testify to help us get to this point. All of that is critical into getting here. And my intention with this motion is to try and balance all of that input as we are required to do under the Magnuson Act. I think that this motion, although a bit complex, as we usually do, I have tried to balance the additions and revisions that I'm suggesting here to really make sure, however, that we can move this document forward for analysis and move forward, in my view, ideally for final action the next time we see it. That is really my goal. The SSC determined that the document, with some suggested modifications, is ready to be released for the next steps and to take final action. And so I really believe that this motion provides the council with a reasonable range of alternatives with which to consider taking final action at the next stage. Of course, we always have to make that decision based on the analysis that comes back. And so in terms of, I think I've gone through my intent of trying to essentially pick up the AP motion. Again, I very much appreciated the work that went into that and have tried to pick up some of those concepts and where the AP picked up concepts in a couple of cases, particularly with the CDQ, CHUM, PSC reserve pool, perhaps put a little bit more specificity in the motion so that staff have a little more to work with there. Madam Chair, I'm going to stop talking because I need a drink of water and answer any questions.
Thank you, Ms. Baker. Thank you for your work on this motion. I'm just going to pause for a second and see any questions. Ms. Vanderhoven.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Ms. Baker, for your motion. I have two questions. The first one on the CDQ buffer, I'm not clear from the motion how the amount of that buffer is determined. And so I guess I would be looking for some guidance from you on what the expectation would be for staff on that.
I'd also like to know we have staff here to assist with any questions that come up during the deliberation, since this is a very detailed motion. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you for the question. My understanding is that the pool amount would be determined by the differential of any CDQ apportionment rate that we establish, that we select in one of the options. So the difference between that and whatever the catcher vessel or mothership apportionment is that we've selected, and whatever the CDQ group or groups expects its quota to be caught on, either the catcher vessel in the catcher vessel or mothership sector. That's the most basic explanation that I can provide. Fortunately, our staff have been able to take a preliminary look at this, and again, based on just a quick look, initial assessments, we would expect that no more than 2.5% of whatever cap is chosen would be needed to fund the CDQ pool, and potentially in many years, perhaps none. And so one other thing I did want to specify in terms of the analysis, since you asked, thank you, Ms. Vanderhoven, is I just wanted to be clear that I would not expect that this option would be pulled through in detail through every retrospective table in the analysis, because we do have a lot of tables for that apportionment option, but instead could be discussed qualitatively throughout the relevant sections as it impacts the selections that we're making under the apportionment options. I hope that helps.
That does. Thank you, Ms. Baker. My second question was in relation to alternative 5, option 3, and the sub options of 75% or 90%. And I think the numbers in alternative 3, option 2, included a range that equated to 50%. And I guess I'm looking to see if there was an intentional reason not to be consistent across the two.
Through the chair, thank you. There was the sub options in option 3 are intended to be directly responsive to public testimony that we heard in terms of what high abundance actually means in particularly the Yukon River, which is what I'm proposing here for the index threshold. And we heard a lot of testimony, and I definitely heard a lot of testimony in the sense that these percentiles that we're looking at may not necessarily capture true abundance in terms of health of the run, not just size, but health of the run. And if we're looking at potentially relieving caps on an annual basis, I just honestly felt that a more conservative abundance-based threshold was warranted for this particular option, because I think just from my own perspective, I think, although I'm leaving alternative 3 on the table, I personally think alternative 5 seems at this stage a bit more responsive to the council's purpose and need statement to minimize Western Alaska chum salmon bycatch. And so I think if I'm really thinking in my mind, if I want, and I did, I wanted an abundance-based threshold. This is a mechanism that seems to really work, and I wanted to capture a more conservative, if you will, abundance-based threshold for this before the cap would be relieved. Whereas in alternative 3, as I mentioned, we're looking at a different scenario. It's a low abundance threshold. And so in my mind, that warranted, and that was rationale for not including 50th percentile in here. I think between 50th and 75th percentile is, I wanted a distinction between the two, I guess is how I could say that more simply.
Thank you. And Ms. Kimball.
Thank you. Thank you for the motion, Ms. Baker. I have a few questions. One very simple question under alternative 2. And I think just maybe in the way I was reading it, I want to make sure that the sub option, the new sub option about the CDQ pool, that does not need to be selected. We have an option at final action not to select it. But if we do select it, we have to do it in combination with one of options 1 through 4. Is that how I should read that language?
Through the chair, thank you, Ms. Kimball. Yes, that's a great clarification.
Thank you. And through the chair, another question then in relation to Ms. Vanderhoven's question about what we might expect to see in the analysis. And you mentioned some qualitative assessment, but we would then, if this passes, be able to see kind of the maximum amount that would be making up this pool in the case that it was ever used. So we would know exact numbers in that case. And I don't know if it's appropriate to ask staff to talk a little bit more about what you mentioned, because it does look like a lot of work to pull this through into every single portion of the analysis. Even though it's just a sub option, it would proliferate through every other piece. So I'd feel more comfortable understanding what level of work that is or how they approach it, if that's okay.
Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Meriden.
Good morning, Madam Chair, members of the council, Sarah Meriden, council staff. So speaking to this CDQ pool reserve idea, I had a little bit of time to think through the concept. As was spoken to, I think the concept here is looking at if a CDQ sector moved from what has recently been taking place, where they've been having a lot of that quota being leased in the CP sector, or all of it has recently been associated with the CP sector. If they move to the inshore sector, and we're looking at the options, the apportionment options that are based off of history, there's a different ratio associated with the chum proportion to pollock proportion for those two sectors. So this is looking at a pool that could, for that group in that year, even that out based off of those different apportionment options. So for this analysis, we would calculate what would need to be in that pool in order to fund if in a year all of the CDQ groups chose to move to the inshore sector and have their CDQ pollock quota harvested by the inshore sector, and they wanted that apportionment, that ratio of chum PSC to pollock allocated to that sector to be even with what the inshore sector had. So we would calculate what that would be under the different apportionment options, just the ones based off of history with the different limits, and we could provide for you in that limited analysis what range that would be, what percentage that would be. For alternative 2, it looks like this one could also apply to alternative 5, which would be different numbers and different amounts. But in a more limited analysis, we would focus on what those amounts would be. Theoretically, that could also be pulled through every retrospective table that we have in the document, because those would change the apportionments and total amount of PSC that could happen in those years. So my understanding based on the discussion is we would not do that piece of the analysis, and we would really just focus on what this new apportionment would mean in terms of potential for additional salmon PSC and what that would amount to under each of the alternatives and options.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Ms. Meriden. I feel like that's important for council members to understand if we're setting expectations for what we might see in the next draft, and I think helpful in order to understand. We're trying to accommodate a situation that has not happened. They use all their quota on CPs, and so I think it's an appropriate level of analysis for that. But maybe council members can give that some thought as we continue to ask questions. I did have another one when I can have more time, but I can wait if you want.
Okay. Thank you, Ms. Marinan. Yeah, I appreciate the clarification as well, and believe that's an appropriate expectation for this new sub option, considering the additional changes that we're making and the amount of time that it may take staff to address those changes. So, Ms. Kimball, do you have another question?
I do. I have a question actually on alternative 4, and it's not in a change, but it is part of the motion, and it's the bullet 5. In response to some of the testimony about hearing how we could continue to be more transparent. Is it in your assessment, Ms. Baker, that at final action, if the council was interested in kind of putting more meat on the bones on number 5, either in what would be provided or in who to be provided to, that might be possible at final action? There's nothing in my estimation that you really analyze for that, but it seems a little vague, I think, to some folks, and I'm wondering if you think we could build out that at final action, or that would need to be done today.
Through the chair, thank you for the question. And I have had a few side conversations about that. And I think we did receive a little bit of testimony about that component 5 in the IPAs. And I agree with your assessment that that is something that that the council could, and indeed, I personally would hope we would build out at final action. I personally don't remember receiving concrete suggestions that seemed supported broadly, and so I wasn't ready to put any forward today. But I think where we are in this process, that would be a really helpful thing to add some more detail to at final action based on some conversations perhaps that can take place between now and final action. I would really like to see that.
Yes, Ms. Kimball.
No other hands are popping up, so I'm going to keep going. I have one more on alternative 5, and I appreciate the work that you put into this. And I do see it's based off the AP motion, but I do want to better understand, based on trying to stay on our time schedule, how you feel we might, maybe we need staff again, but we might analyze something like alternative 5 option 2. And I ask that because it seems as if the entire point of this is to try to be responsive in what we're seeing in the water, and assume that the right corridor closure area might not be the same every single year. And so I read this as the AP's intent and your intent, I assume, to try to modify that on a yearly basis based on the factors, but it's fairly flexible. And so I'm curious, maybe I'll say it this way. I would assume that staff is not going to try to speculate on every single different stat area combination that might comprise alternative 5 option 2. I see they're going to have their hands full already with alternative 5 option 1 and the sub option. But is it your understanding or assumption that they would be kind of describing the process to go through, the process that would be envisioned under option 2, but not try to provide a bunch of different combinations that would essentially be speculation? So I wanted to hear, and if staff needs to come up for that, I'm fairly comfortable with that, but I just wanted to hear your assumption.
Through the chair, thank you. Yes, and I had an opportunity to speak with staff directly about that. And my assumption is the same as yours, is that this motion is not asking staff to do any sort of speculative assessment of all the different stat areas that may be included in the closure. I'm not asking for any kind of speculation. The topic came up of the fleet movement model that was attempted to be used for this version of the analysis. I am not expecting staff to use that sort of model to try and determine what might happen under alternative 5 option 2. Yes, my intent would be that really what would be most helpful is yes, just to explain the process by which the closure areas would be determined under the different criteria that have been established under alternative 5 option 2.
Thank you. And Mr. Curlin.
Thanks, Madam Chair. Thanks, Ms. Baker, very much for the thoughtful motion. Continuing with the theme about expectations for staff here, I wonder if we could just be explicit about something that may have been implicit in your motion and rationale, and that's recognizing that I understand the intent of your motion is to proceed along the time track reflected in scenario 1 in our action memo, which is that this would not come back for additional council review before it's published, but also recognizing that we're asking a lot of staff at this point in what they can reasonably do with a goal of having the document ready for the National Marine Fisheries Service to publish it in August or thereabouts. I guess what I'm seeking clarification on is if staff doing the best that they can reasonably do in the time that's available between now and then come to a realization that there are some obstacles, that there are problems with doing a sufficient analysis in that time frame, that conceivably the council could hear that at staff tasking in June, for example, and reassess where we are. That there may be although I have a lot of confidence in staff, but there may be obstacles that come up, and just being maybe transparent about that if such obstacles come up, we may need to revisit our assumptions. And I guess I'm just wondering if that's something you or Mr. Witherell have thought through here.
Okay. Through the chair. Thank you, Mr. Curlin, for that. I do appreciate it. And yes, I think I have certainly thought of that, and you did a very good job of describing my understanding of what the council always has to do in terms of all of its actions. And that is, although I did state very clearly my ideal would be, yes, the timeline laid out in the scenario 1 timeline laid out in the action memo. I do recognize that this motion has some proposed changes that are heavy analytical lifts. And so the council may very well have to consider if obstacles come up or things that staff didn't anticipate, because again, another primary goal in terms of moving this forward, although I think these changes are a heavy analytical burden, I currently think just my understanding of these proposed changes and the likely outcomes of the impacts of these alternatives is I feel like those likely impacts are within the range of what we've already analyzed. I really feel like we're just refining where we may end up. And so I really feel confident that the next time we see this analysis, whenever that is, that we'll be able to take final action. But of course, we will have to make that assessment whenever that takes place. And I don't know, Madam Chair, I didn't want to get into, we always talk about, actual timing and staff tasking. So I hope I didn't wade into that too much. I will defer to you.
No, thank you. And we don't have staff tasking scheduled for this meeting, so it's appropriate to have this conversation right now. I think in that scenario A that Mr. Curlin was referring to, I think it had us on an implementation timeline of 2027. As is typical, Mr. Witherall and I will coordinate after meetings to discuss priorities and scheduling relative to those priorities and timing. We had in that plan a potential next meeting scheduled for December. We'll have to coordinate with staff to see if that's reasonable based on, their they'll absorb what we're trying to do here, and give us some feedback. But we may have some room to also revisit an option to meet in February if necessary, to give staff a little more time and still maintain the implementation timeline, as well as the proper review for the agency. So that's something that we'll have a discussion about following this meeting. Thanks.
Thanks, Madam Chair. I appreciate the discussion on that.
Yes, Mr. Ritchie.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Ms. Baker, for the motion. My question is specific to option 3, alternative 5. I guess I'm looking at sub-option 1 and sub-option 2, the index values, and I'm just wondering if you could clarify where the values that we see there are coming from. Yeah, well, if you could expand a little bit on the time series that was used.
Oh, sure. Yes. Let me make sure that I have that. I might need to phone a friend on this one. But what my intention was to use the same time series that we used in alternative 3, option 2. And I'm trying to find that in my notes here. And so the same time series that we used to calculate the 25th and 50th percentile in alternative 3, option 2, we used that same time series. Can you tell me the years? Thank you. 1992 to 2022 to calculate the 75th and 90th percentile. And those are the numbers that result.
Thank you.
Yes, Mr. Sugata.
Yes, thank you for the motion through the chair. Just a quick clarification. In alternative 2, your first paragraph, we talk about a range of 100,000 to 550,000. I noticed that there's an approximation for Western Alaska chum salmon. I just wanted to verify that that's just for information purposes. There's not like 2 sets of numbers for the metrics.
Through the chair. Thank you, Mr. Sakata, for that question. Yes, that we have been including this estimate in our motions, I believe, at a couple meetings now. And my intention of providing so I'll just read through that. For the 100,000 chum salmon PSC limit, the approximately 17,100 Western Alaska chum salmon, that estimate is based on the genetic proportion data from 2011 through 2023.
Thank you. Just another quick follow-up. So when we know that there's a Western Alaska genetic cluster, but does this Western Alaska chum salmon include the upper and middle Yukon in its numbers?
Through the chair, yes, Mr. Sukata. What I refer to here as Western Alaska chum salmon includes the coastal Western Alaska genetic stock proportion and the upper middle Yukon genetic stock proportion.
Thank you.
Yes, Mr. Twite.
Thanks, Madam Chair. Ms. Baker, thanks much for the motion. It distills a lot of conversations and a lot of hard work. I'm thinking a little bit about Mr. Ritchie's question to you and your response, and because I was thinking of asking a similar question. And I was kind of looking at this option 3 under alternative 5 in a way as if you look through the lens of a salmon recovery plan and a salmon recovery effort, the 2 levels that are suggested here for analysis both sort of represent beginning to meet objectives. And I'm not guessing that you intend these to represent full recovery or anything like that, but they sort of function in a way as markers of progress from a salmon recovery perspective. And I'm just wondering if any part of the choice of 75th and 90th was grounded in any assessment of any of the the sort of the recovery documents or the gravel to gravel plans that we've been hearing about. If there's any connection there, or is this really more just working within our own data? And part of that is also, we've heard that 92 through 2022 is really a time when salmon haven't been faring as well as previously. So just wondering if you had any sort of thoughts about how these related back to somewhat larger efforts to work back towards what I think the targets might be for long-term recovery.
Through the chair, thank you for that question, Mr. Twite, and I do appreciate it. I have to be honest, I did not have the time to work through taking the data that we had in terms of the Yukon River summer and fall run reconstructions and what we've already looked at in terms of abundance for alternative 3 and relate it to any kind of relate it to the other work that's ongoing in terms of recovery plans. I think that would have been ideal. But that just based on the concept that the SSC put forward, which I wanted to ensure that we picked up in this version of the analysis, what I was really trying to do with this abundance-based threshold is, yes, use the data that we currently have in our analysis and incorporate really the testimony that we heard in terms of without being able necessarily to quantify what a salmon recovery threshold is for these runs. Really, what I heard loud and clear is that the council should be doing everything it can to help Western Alaska chum get back to the rivers. And so, no, I did not equate these percentages or even attempt to do that with a particular plan that might be in place. But it, based on the information we had and the testimony that we heard, I think those are that's what I'm trying to incorporate those things and just show that at least I think the data that we're looking at for the reasons you just said, we heard very clear testimony that the data we're looking at may not be the whole picture. And therefore, that's why I felt a little more conservative sub-option was in order and put forward the 75th percentile and 90th percentile.
Thank you. Any other questions? Any amendments on the motion? Ms. Vanderhoven.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I sent an amendment to staff.
We'll wait for that to come up on the screen. Okay, Ms. Vanderhoven.
Thank you, Madam Chair. The amendment goes to alternative 5, option 3, and the amendment would be to add a sub-option 3, the 50th percentile Yukon summer 1,978,705, and Yukon River fall 803,000. And with a second, I can speak to it briefly.
Second.
Thank you for the second, Mr. Ritchie.
Thank you, Mr. Ritchie. Ms. Baker, I really appreciate your answer to Mr. Twite's questions and all the other questions about this particular alternative. We also heard in public comment, maybe not as frequently, but we did hear in public comment also the 50th percentile. And I think, as noted with Mr. Twite's question, not having any relation at this point to salmon recovery plans, I think a broader range for where we are in the process, including 50%, would be a reasonable approach to where we are in the process. Thanks.
Thank you. Any questions on the amendment? Any comments on the amendment? Mr. Twite?
As I sort of thinking a little further on the discussion that Ms. Baker and I were having about this particular subject, it occurred to me as well that we do have a bit of a marker just in terms of the ANS estimates, and I am not at all familiar with those. So I would expect that analysis, particularly of this newest one, might to some extent just take a look at what the run sizes are that are associated with beginning to meet ANS targets. And from that perspective, I think I'm interested in understanding better where the various stepping points are. And when we're down this far, when the hole that we're in is as deep as it is right now, it's hard to imagine, and it's even, I know for a lot of people, it's probably even a little very hard to talk about even what this might look like. But it is incumbent on us as a council, lacking actual salmon recovery plans that give us a roadmap. It's incumbent on us to look forward a ways and imagine what things might look like if as runs begin to improve. For that reason, and really only for that reason, I'll sort of reluctantly support this, but I am extremely nervous about this provision in general and the depth of the hole we're in right now. And it is hard to imagine. I have some closing comments about the importance of salmon recovery plans to helping us understand, and that this flows directly from that. And I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Mr. Twite. Ms. Kimball?
Thank you. Thank you for putting up the amendment and having some discussion. I can't support the amendment. I think we forget in some part what we're doing here. This is really an on-off switch to the entire crux of the action. And in that case, I think Ms. Baker did a great job describing why a very high percentile is needed. I think we also heard in response the years used, and we're continuing to change the baseline of what constitutes kind of an okay salmon run. And I think even at the 75th percentile, I'm uncomfortable. I'm uncomfortable with the whole option in some cases. So I'm not comfortable at all with even looking at the 50th percentile. I do think some of the information that Mr. Twite just mentioned is actually in our current document, and we can go back and look at what that looks like and how many years that would turn on and off, I guess, if you're interested in that. But those are my brief comments. I'm not in support.
Thank you. And Mr. Ritchie?
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Ms. Vanderhoven, for the motion to amend. I would second the comments of Ms. Kimball. I don't think I'll be supporting this. I would just like to point out that I kind of see option 3 here as a bit of a compromise, given what we've heard in public testimony and in conversation at the AP, that the years used for this index already include 2 extremely low returns, and that previous years may have had much better returns, and in many perspectives, those are the goals that we should be shooting for. So, well, I thank you for the motion to amend. I will not be supporting it. Thank you.
Thank you. Any further comments on the amendment? Mr. Mueller?
Yeah, thank you, Madam Chairman. Thank you for the amendment. I too cannot support the amendment for some of the comments already mentioned around the table, but in particular, Mr. Twite's comment about the incredible hole we are in. So again, I appreciate the amendment, but I will not be supporting it.
Thank you, Mr. Mueller. Mr. Sakata?
Yes, thank you for the amendment. I'm still undecided in a sense that I'm trying to do some quick math here with some help, but maybe I'm looking at the wrong data. But at the 90th percentile, it looks like in the last 30 years, 1 year would have triggered the cap in 1 year. At 75% level, 5 years is kind of what I'm looking at. Given that that's over the last 30 years, I'm trying to think back to see if there was like commercial viable opportunities. And if that was the case, I would think that would signal to me at least that if there's a commercially available run, that could at least be used as analysis. We certainly don't have to go with the 50th, but my initial quick analysis just seems like, at least for consideration, just like at the 90th percentile, it's 1. If that number holds true, that it seems like some number lower than 75 should at least be looked at to just be bookends.
Thank you. And Mr. Blahovdi?
I just want to speak to the option in general. I really appreciate Ms. Kimball's comments on that. The Fish and Wildlife Service had concern about this type of this idea of one, just using the Yukon River as your gauge when we know the Kuskokwim River and other Western Alaska rivers also have different numbers. We've seen different returns on chum. And then so also using the prior year's run abundance when there's a risk of always fishing on the wrong timing of chum for the pollock industry when you're doing that. And so the timing is a question for us too. And so then getting into the sub options, you get even further concern from a biological perspective. And so I really appreciate what Ms. Kimball brought up though. And I don't have a vote, just wanted to raise that. Thanks.
Thank you. And Mr. Williams?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm going to be supporting the amendment. I certainly agree with Mr. Sakata that I think the option to look at this range is important. I personally don't believe that we would ever probably get to the point of maybe employing sub option 3. However, I think we should look at a broader range to be able to be sure that we have all the information we need. I frankly agree with Ms. Baker regarding the conservative nature, but at the same time, in terms of our ability to look at the information that's available to us and look at a broader range, I think that's what's a responsible thing to do. So thank you.
Any further comments on the amendment? Mr. Twite?
As I indicated in my first set of comments, I could really see arguments in both directions, and I've listened to arguments in both directions. And so I don't have to explain myself later. I think I am going to vote no on this at this point. I'm still quite torn, but I really don't like going down this path further until I've seen some salmon recovery plans that really outline what our targets are. And I don't want to presuppose too much.
Thank you, Mr. Twite. We will take a roll call on the vote for the amendment on new sub option 3 in red on the screen. Mr. Witherell.
Calling the roll on adding sub-option 3. Ms. Kimball,
No.
Mr. Kurland,
No.
Mr. Moeller,
No.
Mr. Ritchie,
No.
Mr. Sukata,
Yes.
Mr. Twite,
No.
Ms. Vanderhoven,
Yes.
Mr. Williams,
Yes.
Ms. Baker,
No.
Mr. Abnika.
No.
Motion fails 3-7.
Thank you. Any further amendments? We have the main motion on the floor. We'll move to comments on the motion. Ms. Vanderhoven.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Again, Ms. Baker, thank you for your motion. I know a lot of work went into it and it's appreciated. And once again, staff especially, we ask the world of you and somehow you managed to produce it. And I'd also like to thank everyone who provided public comment on this issue, both orally and in writing. I found a lot of value in both. I can never completely understand the full extent of the loss being experienced by those affected by salmon declines in Western Alaska, and everything that goes along with that. But with every story and conversation that we have in this process, I learn a little bit more, and I look forward to continuing to learn from you. There are no easy answers that we can provide in this forum, but I think the motion that we have before us gets us closer to that. When the analysis comes back, we can better evaluate the trade-offs between the options. I appreciate all of the effort that's gone into modifying the corridor concept in Alternative 5. The original Alternative 5 corridor created some disproportionate negative impacts to mostly the smaller vessels in the shoreside fleet who have the most operational constraints as well. So I appreciate that we're looking at ways to alleviate that somewhat. I think the new options introduced in the motion may provide better balance of helping to protect Western Alaska without extraordinary impacts to the pollock fleet, the shoreside processors and the downstream folks who would be impacted, communities, support sector services, and other fisheries who are dependent on a healthy shoreside processing fleet. Regarding herring, we haven't talked a lot about herring, but I'm very concerned about the squeezing the bubble to try to do something to help Western Alaska chum and then inadvertently exacerbating the problem that we have with Chinook salmon. The winter savings area for herring comprises about 30% of cluster 4. That's a really big area to move folks out of. I anticipate that the analysis will show a relatively minor impact to herring while potentially keeping the fleet in areas that tend to be cleaner as far as Chinook goes. And so I'm going to go ahead and support the motion. I think this helps us move the ball forward. And once again, I would just like to thank everybody who's put so much time and effort, our advisory bodies and the public. It's a long process and it's a bit of a grind, but I think we'll get through it and come out with something that is meaningful in the end. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Vanderhoven. Any other comments? Mr. Kurland.
Thanks, Madam Chair. Again, thanks to Ms. Baker for the motion. Huge thanks to Council and NIMS staff and our 3 cooperating agencies for a really well-developed preliminary draft EIS. I also want to relay huge thanks and immense respect for the members of the public who provided written comments and/or testified to us. I think in-river subsistence users were tremendously effective in communicating to all of us the importance of chum salmon to your lives, food security, and culture. So I thank you for that. CDQ communities, shoreside support businesses, and others were also very effective in communicating the importance of the pollock fishery, not only for directly dependent businesses, but also for critical social and economic support programs for the 65 CDQ communities. The decline that we're seeing in Chinook and chum salmon runs in Western Alaska is heartbreaking. I don't think there's any other fishery issue in Alaska that so powerfully demonstrates the challenges that we're all facing from climate change. And this is summarized pretty poignantly, I think, in the executive summary of the preliminary draft EIS, noting that the recent declines in chum salmon bycatch that we've seen are likely the result of fleet behavioral changes, but also changes in the distribution and abundance of chum salmon and pollock. That discussion also notes that the best available science suggests that ecosystem and climate changes are the leading cause of the chum salmon declines, and notes that in 2016 and 2019, Western Alaska chum were subject to heat waves in both of their major marine habitats, which shifted the food web, altered chum salmon diets. Juvenile salmon were observed to consume less diverse and less nutritious foods and exhibited significantly lower energy density, presumably because of those dietary changes and higher metabolism associated with warmer ocean conditions. And it goes on. The council cannot stop climate change, but the preliminary draft EIS also notes that chum salmon taken as bycatch in the Bering Sea pollock fisheries reduces the amount of chum salmon that may return to Western and interior Alaska river systems. And we've heard clearly the concern that even though the pollock fishery is relatively clean and catches few salmon compared to pollock, the concern that every salmon matters to in-river communities. And of course, the Magnuson-Stevens Act requires us to minimize bycatch to the extent practicable. So here we are. The purpose and need for the action, with which everybody here is familiar with, notes that our goal is to reduce chum salmon bycatch in the pollock fishery to the extent practicable, with a particular focus on minimizing the bycatch of Western Alaska origin chum. So it strikes me that the council's challenge here is to strike a balance. It clearly would not be practicable to close the pollock fishery and forego all of its benefits to the nation. So how can we meaningfully minimize chum bycatch without unreasonable effects on the pollock fishery and without unintended consequences for other important management objectives like minimizing Chinook bycatch? I think we benefited from really thoughtful feedback and ideas from everyone involved, from tribal groups, industry, and others, to help refine the corridor concept, in particular in Alternative 5. And again, I thank Ms. Baker for her motion. I think this will put us in a good position to seek broader input via the NEPA process and to inform final recommendations from the council to the National Marine Fisheries Service in December.
Thank you, Mr. Curlin. Mr. Ritchie.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Ms. Baker, for the motion. I don't have a lot to say. I'll try to be brief. I just wanted to, like Mr. Curlin said, thank staff and cooperating agencies and council members in the AP for working so hard on getting us here. I also wanted to thank everyone who testified. And I wanted to take a moment just to acknowledge that I think it takes a lot of strength to come up here and to testify in a space that sometimes doesn't feel, well, sometimes and for some doesn't feel like it's your own space. And I wanted to thank you for being brave and for doing that. I think it's changing things here. I've seen it change since I started in this process, and that makes me happy. I hope in the future that This space can feel like your own because if it doesn't, then this process isn't working, and the worst parts of it have a lot more power than they ever should. So, thank you.
Thank you. And Ms. Kimball.
Thank you. I think I jumped the line over there, but okay. Thank you. I'll be brief as well, in part because I align myself with Mr. Curlin's comments and Mr. Ritchie, and definitely in the thanks. I think what people offered to us here and their time and their stories and their knowledge is very valuable and very generous. I'm a little skeptical of some of the additional options. I think maybe you could hear that in part for their effect and in part for the amount of staff work that it'll take. I really appreciate the opportunity to be able to clarify with staff the approach to those. So we're setting our expectations, including my own, when we see the final draft. And so for that reason, I feel comfortable with the whole motion and will certainly support it. I do think we kind of skimmed through, the SSC recommendations as practicable, but a couple of those general recommendations I think are going to be really important. Some of those is grouping the information in one place so people can get the salient points more quickly. And some is in kind of paring down and really focusing on those salient points specifically in the executive summary. And I've been carrying around this humongous binder, and it's a lift, literally and figuratively, I think, for council and for the public to try to understand how to use it in order to make a decision. And so I appreciate anything staff can do and they've continued to do to try to make it more accessible for people. And I think sometimes the length of it is part of the major problem. I do think that one thing that I really felt out of this meeting, aside from hearing all of the amazing input and stories, was that there just wasn't any real contention about the purpose and need statement. Everyone seemed in agreement that we are here for that purpose. And so I feel at least that what we're doing now is debating the best way to approach that, similar to what Mr. Curlin said. How do we balance and how do we provide an effective action under the Magnuson Act? I do feel comfortable that this motion puts us in a better place. We've really taken a lot, specifically in the corridor concept, from Western Alaska folks that have come and provided us more information about the need for that or the practical management use of a corridor like that. And I really think we're moving in the right direction that way. So based on the discussion about the schedule, I hope it's clear that the council intends to stay on schedule for implementation. What it sounded to me is there may be some leeway in the date at which we take final action, but we don't have intent to change the date of implementation. And I think that's very important. So thank you, and thanks again to Ms. Baker for the motion.
Thank you, Ms. Kimball and Mr. Williams.
Thank you, Madam Chair. First, let me say, as others have, thank you to Ms. Baker and to the AP for development of the motion. As always, the motion is beyond technically sound. It's very thoughtful. And as I look at it in context of all of the testimony we heard, it also is responsive in quite a number of areas to the kind of things that were provided to us. I think the other thing that's important to me is I listened to the testimony that we heard. The folks that I heard some amazing stories about just what it took folks to get here to testify. And certainly from my own perspective, I learned a great deal about some things that I knew nothing about, frankly, before I sat down here. I think the motion we have before us is going to give us an opportunity to look at a broad range. And from that, we'll then make some final decisions. But I had someone mention to me that sometimes they felt like maybe we didn't take actions that made it look like we cared. And frankly, at least from my own perspective, and I think I can speak for others up here, I don't think there's a person up here that doesn't care. These are very difficult and challenging things that we're trying to deal with. And so sometimes maybe we don't always respond or react in a way that everybody would agree with. But I don't think there's anybody up here that does not care. And so not only do we have people come a long ways to testify, we had a lot of testifying from the fleet that was out on the ocean fishing. Another big effort to try and get input. And I guess maybe in summing that all up, thank you to the staff, certainly to the chair and others for providing about as broad an opportunity to testify and get input in as that I've ever participated in. We had almost every angle and way you could get here to testify. So thank you for that as well. So Ms. Baker, I appreciate the motion. I think we've got something good to work with here. I am a little concerned about the workload that Mr. Curlin mentioned to us and how we may be able to accomplish all that, but I'm confident we'll be able to work our way through that and hopefully stay on track for what we originally anticipated for a schedule. So thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Williams and Mr. Mueller.
Yeah, thank you, Madam Chairman. Thank you, Ms. Baker, for the motion. I'm particularly grateful for all the public testimony that we've heard over the last 3 or 4 days. I think it's was profound. I think it was certainly moving, including the comments about the next time I'm lost in the village for the help that they offered up. So, but seriously, Madam Chair, I think this was an amazing opportunity for this council to better understand the Alaska Native way of life. And I'll continue to look at those opportunities as a council member to open those doors and so that we have the best understanding that we possibly can. I think this motion is on the right path. I think it's certainly reflective, as others have said here, of public comment, and I think it's getting us close. It's getting us a step closer. And lastly, it's responsive, I believe, to what we all agree with in the problem statement here. So for those reasons, I again thank Ms. Baker for all the thought and the work she put into this motion, and I will be supporting it. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Mueller and Mr. Twait.
Thanks, Madam Chair, and thanks, Ms. Baker, for the motion, which I do support. If it wasn't clear to me before, and I think it was, it certainly is just abundantly clear that we're in the midst of a humanitarian crisis. And that means so many things to me on so many levels. And I'd like to just touch on a couple of them and try not to repeat much of what my fellow council members have said that I strongly support. But because this is one of the hardest challenges that I certainly hope I will encounter in my life, I reflect on what we've asked of staff. We've handed them, and I can say this with certainty, the hardest analysis task, the hardest sort of reporting task that I've ever seen us hand to staff. And I really appreciate their efforts, and I appreciate everybody's sensitivity about what that burden has been for staff. We've certainly challenged a lot of faces and voices from Western Alaska with the task of coming up here and trying to describe the unimaginable to us. That's got to be immensely hard. And people have done it with grace and dignity that I'm not at all sure I could have mustered. So I appreciate that. And it helps, as my fellow council members have said. I've heard, I understand there's still many communication gulfs that exist. And I guess I'd like to just briefly mention a couple of those. I've heard a lot of reminders to us as the council that there are some really deep cultural values that are held by the many different tribes, the many different language groups of Alaska Natives, but these are common across all of them. And I believe they're common with us too. And I guess I'd just like to briefly describe them, undoubtedly using Western terms, and probably not as well as I could, but take only what you need. I like that. I embrace that. And as I think about our Bering Sea management of groundfish, we harvest only 2 million metric tons. It's an immense number. but I mean it when I say only. The Bering Sea has been historically, and Lord, I hope it remains that way, one of the world's most productive large marine ecosystems. We could have, were it not for a 2 million metric ton cap, this year, the SSC told us we could have set the combined across all species ceiling on harvest at 3.59 million. It's not quite 100% larger, but and why do we do that? Why do we have the 2 million metric ton cap? Well, one thing is Congress told us, but we were part of that, developing that. And why were we? Because we were thinking about the ecosystem and long term. What's a way to avoid every year stretching the ecosystem to the max and taking the max yield? What's a way instead to take only what we need and leave lots of room for the ecosystem to function? Well, 2 million metric ton cap is that. Is it perfect? No. It's arbitrary, but it's in our Western science, it's a way for us to think about take only what we need. I don't want to say it's without fault, but at its heart, it's there as an expression of take only what we need. I've heard a lot about waste, and there is no doubt that as our fisheries have developed, at times there've been wastage, and there's no doubt that there are still, in many cases by regulation, in some cases by individual fishers' choice, times when edible fish are discarded overboard, and I'm not proud of that. But every year, this council has worked to decrease the amount of that, and we've had some great successes. I hear people talk about what the trawl fisheries looked like in the early 90s and point to that as wastage. Can't argue with that. But these are not the trawl fisheries of the early 90s. And particularly with salmon. We started out with salmon as you cannot retain on board by rule. They had to be discarded at sea. That's waste, yes. That's changed. And we will continue to look for more ways to ensure that every salmon that is caught as bycatch in the groundfish fisheries will not be wasted. And we've gotten a lot closer to that, and we'll continue to look for ways. I'm not trying to defend us. I'm trying to say that when I look at this through my Western science eyes, my Western culture eyes, I believe that we are continuing to improve towards the cultural values that we're hearing about. And I'd like to continue that, but I believe we are making progress, and I believe we do embrace those values. Another one is corridors, and I think we're closer on that. It was when the idea first came up, and it was sort of first proposed, it was a little bit of a well, duh moment for me in a way that, my own duh to myself of, well, yeah, salmon that are returning home, not the ones that are ranging the ocean and feeding and still growing, but the salmon that are done growing, that are beginning their journey home, of course they follow corridors. Same corridors that their ancestors have followed that may shift around a bit in timing and depending on where they're coming from, if ecosystem change forces them to move their feeding grounds some, it'll shift some, but yeah, they follow paths. And those paths are historic and should be knowable. And then at this meeting, we hear about an extraordinary tool to allow us to know those paths with a fair amount of accuracy. And that the work of the Bristol Bay SRI, their Science Research Institute, is really hopeful to me for really being able to, with our Western science, be able to, in real time, quantify what I think many people here who hold traditional knowledge have known and understood for a long time. So it's an area where I think we're moving together as well. And I'm excited about that. I'm going to switch gears just and briefly talk about salmon recovery because I am from the lower 48 and salmon recovery plans have been my Bible, unfortunately, for a long time because we've had salmon recovery needs down there for a long time. Many of the first plans were written by the tribes who of the lower 48 who really first understood the need for gravel to gravel management well before my state agency did, well before National Marine Fisheries Service administering the ESA did. They got it and they used that lens to begin to develop salmon recovery plans. And they're the first ones who talked about healthy and harvestable as the ultimate target. It's not good enough just to achieve delisting in the lower 48. And we all embrace this now. We strive to healthy and harvestable. And those words were echoing through my mind over and over and over again during public testimony, because what I was hearing over and over again was that this isn't just a humanitarian crisis of nutrition and public health and loss of income. It's a humanitarian crisis as well as the loss of culture, the loss of health of communities, of families, of individuals, because the people are really inseparable from the salmon. The DNA runs through. And that's, in my lower 48, somewhat westernized parlance, that's healthy and harvestable. And as you look at through healthy and harvestable, you have to think about all the different impediments to that. What are all the things that we've done to change the ecosystems that these fish depend on? You have to inventory those, and that's what a salmon recovery plan is an inventory of all those and a recipe for addressing them so that you can understand in context, well, if in the Columbia River, if we fix hydro, will that alone be enough? No, but it'll make a huge step. So one of the first priorities was addressing hydro. We haven't fixed it, but we've really improved it a lot. This would help me so much in December if I could view gravel to gravel, first draft, whatever, salmon recovery plans, so I could understand what we as a council can contribute to salmon recovery and also understand what our role is in the larger context of all the actions. And we heard so many different actions. We heard references to so many of those different actions. It would help me understand exactly how to balance what the Magnuson Act requests that we balance in the context of the importance of that to salmon recovery. I understand a lot better now the importance of it to individual families and others, but I still don't really understand what it's going to take to recover Yukon River chum salmon, which have fallen to lows that I would never have imagined possible. I still don't fully understand what it's going to take to recover Yukon River Chinook salmon, Kuskokwim River chum, Chinook salmon more broadly, but it's salmon recovery plans that help me understand that. And so my plea isn't to staff, because they're not salmon people. My plea is to the salmon people here to help us all understand better what we, the North Pacific Council, can contribute to salmon recovery. And at least as one council member, for me, that's understanding the salmon recovery plans. And they evolve, they grow, they get better over time. I know they're underway, and I look forward to seeing them, the first draft, because for me, that'll be the first step in a more comprehensive, holistic understanding. So again, I thank everybody very much for getting us to this point, and I recognize it's just one more step in a long path.
Thank you for your thoughtful comments, Mr. Toy. I started getting worried that you and Mr. Thompson may have coordinated on a filibuster for the day. Started to sweat there for a minute.
Mr. Thompson, I fell far short. I couldn't even get to 1 hour, much less 36.
I kept on making eye contact. Okay, we're going to move to Mr. Sakata. Oh, yeah, Ms. Baker.
I really, I don't want to, I will be brief. I realized in going through, I wanted to focus on the motion. A couple of things I neglected to say in terms of just, I can't say any better than other council members have said. My appreciation, not just for the public testimony that we received, but the conversations that I individually have had afterward and hope to continue those. And two more expressions of appreciation in this, I was remiss. I thanked council staff and NIMP staff, and of course, I should have included Alaska Department of Fish and Game staff, and particularly Ms. Bush. I apologize for that. And finally, Madam Chair, I wanted to thank you for leading us through this and just in your gracious manner that you always do. I think we heard in public testimony, so thanks.
Thank you, Ms. Baker. That means a lot. Mr. Sakata?
Yes, thank you. I too would like to thank everybody, the staff, you just did a tremendous job. And certainly all the testifiers who came from far places, difficult to come, to be able to provide us with that testimony. It was certainly impactful. I will be supporting this motion. I think it puts us in a better place to make a better final decision as this analysis comes through. I'm amazed at Ms. Baker's ability to take such complex action and to put it onto just a couple of pages. And so thank you very much. We certainly appreciate that. In short, I do have just a couple of concerns, for example, on the CDQ apportionment side of things, where I think it's a little restrictive in the sense where you talk about not being able to move things. And my apologies, I'm trying to pull that up here. It has to be associated with the same sector, I think, in a way that doesn't address some of the emergency side of things that I believe we heard from Mr. Fanning. But I also realize that the alternative is to drown the staff into a million different permutations of study. And so I certainly am not opposing it. I just want to be on record to say that I hope that the analysis come back where there is some flexibility in determining something that's in between, I guess, perhaps. Also, I voted for the failed motion. A slight explanation in the sense that typically in any kind of modeling Excel spreadsheet scenarios, as much like Mr. Williams pointed out, I tend to try to get full information where I can. Oftentimes in a spreadsheet, I'll stick in 0 or a number close to infinity to kind of just check how it behaves outside of a normal range. But certainly, once again, when you start balancing things like staff time, I think that is where we landed is completely appropriate. Special thanks to Mr. Witherall and Ms. Hapala. I had a couple of questions during this process, sent them in at like 5 o'clock, went to bed expecting an answer in the morning, and probably should have stayed up a few more hours because I gathered an answer that evening. So certainly I know that it's not, there are other staff that worked hard, such as the ADF&G staff. And so just my appreciation to them and all the public for testifying. So once again, I will be supporting this motion. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Sakata. I think everyone has had a chance to speak. I'd also like to thank Ms. Baker on her motion and the AP for their work in further refining the alternatives. Generally thank the public, tribal representatives, CDQ representatives, crew and industry for your testimony, the level of engagement and patience with this special meeting. The testimony we received was very valuable. We see that reflected in the motion, and the feedback from the public on how to continue to improve engagement in the process is immensely helpful as we strive to make our space more accessible and welcoming. I think the motion is reflective of where we're at in the process. This is not final action, but potentially and hopefully as articulated by Ms. Baker the last time to make substantive changes to the alternatives before we take final action. In both written and public comment, we received comments regarding changes to Alternative 5 from both subsistence users and industry, and these changes are generally reflected in the motion. I also appreciate that the motion reflects not only the AP's range, but also an expansion on the lower range down to 50,000, which, as we heard in public testimony, was important to some participants to better understand the trade-offs of this action if the clusters were to be combined under alternative 5. I also appreciate the inclusion of the CDQ pool for purposes of analysis. I recognize and support that this new addition is intended to be limited in scope due to it being a risk and not something that has occurred in the past, but believe that it's fair and appropriate to measure to ensure that the existing CDQ transferability isn't lost and if there are continued capacity reductions in the at-sea sector. Also important to note that this provision is to address a discrete issue with apportionment, but that it's the assumption of that sector that CDQ will generally continue to be leased offshore. Lastly, I want to remind everyone that of what we heard from the industry during testimony, that efforts to minimize Western Alaska chum will continue regardless of the implementation date of this action. And lastly, thank staff as well as the ADF&G staff for their patience and tremendous work to release a document well in advance of this meeting to give significant time for the public to review and comment, and for helping to run a productive and successful meeting. Thank you. We're very, very fortunate to have such talented and dedicated people working with us in this process. So safe travels home, everyone. And oh my goodness. I suppose so. Yes, let's take a vote on this. Long meeting. Well, with that, I'll ask if there's any opposition to the motion. Okay. Seeing none, that motion passes without opposition. So safe travels, everyone. Well, meeting adjourned.